So stop me if this sounds like an accurate description of you. You're a rational person. You like science. Maybe you fucking love science. When it comes to your health, your diet, your lifestyle choices, and your concerns for the world, you like to evaluate the data and go wherever it takes you. And these anti GMO people, these homeopathy people, the fucking anti vaxxers, God, they piss you off so much.
Hey, me too. Or kind of. This stuff matters a lot to me. I believe strongly in the scientific method, and I've had to change my mind a lot over the years based on evidence coming my way. Because even if the scientific method, by its very nature, cannot generally give 100% certainly or a strictly correct answer, and even if a lot of science is funded by special interests or by people with a vested interest in one outcome or the other, what better way do we even have to approximate capital T truth in the world? But the question I've had to ask myself a lot lately is, are we spreading the science in a way that works? That is to say, are we effectively communicating the scientific consensus, especially to people who are distrustful of the scientific zeitgeist? After watching friends and strangers talk about this online, especially the spread of misinformation and pseudoscience, I have to conclude no. And we need to figure out how to fix the way we talk about science online. The anti-vax movement makes for a great example of the issues I want to talk about. It's a vexing situation, right? I mean, we've had vaccines for ages, and the research seems to be behind them in virtually every way. The idea of giving your body a piece of a disease-causing organism, or something that looks like one, so you create the necessary immunity to fight the real deal is a simple and brilliant solution to many illnesses. Over the history since the creation of the first vaccine, they have saved countless lives, reduced suffering of humanity globally, and continue to be the best way to prevent the spread of many extremely dangerous diseases. And to top it all off, they're an incredibly safe medical intervention, with common risks ranging from application site irritation, minor symptoms like fatigue, and more risky complications being rare and almost always manageable. Vaccines are pretty dope. And yet there's this movement of people who avoid them because they're afraid of ingredients they don't understand, or hear anecdotes with no evidence to back them up and think they cause autism. And it's been said a million times, but it's still worth saying. They don't. But even if they did, it's pretty fucked up that you'd rather put your child at risk of a potentially life-threatening disease than even entertain the possibility of them being autistic. And not only are they avoiding life-saving medicine and putting their children at risk, they're also putting all children who can't get the vaccine at risk and weakening our herd immunity. And they also think that putting jade in their vagina is a good idea. And they avoid GMOs, and they're named Karen, and god damn it, this stuff makes me so mad! And I guess a lot of that rage is pretty valid, 'cause, risk of child death and stuff. But after the blind rage subsided a bit, I started watching all the people who, like me, were angry and seeing these long pleading posts explaining herd immunity, or more blasé ones about germy crotch goblins. And it really started to hit me. This is all just useless posturing to feel smart and superior at best, and harming our cause at worst. And if you don't care about that, you don't care about this issue. Full stop. What we need is a change of strategy. Right now. Immediately. Using the anti-vax movement as my primary example, I want to argue why this kind of strategy is ineffective, and that we are all to some degree kind of already aware of that, and why we don't seem to care that it doesn't work. Hopefully, since the anti-vax movement is a more extreme example of this, it will also apply neatly to confronting other less harmful movements of this anti-science variety.
It's not hard to understand why the current tactic isn't working if you're being honest with yourself. A lot of the remaining skeptic movement likes to see itself as separate from the most aggressive, holier than thou sort of atheist. But things like being anti GMO, let alone anti vaxxer, seem to be fair game for just the cruelest kind of derision because they deserve it. And I get the argument. Like, they're causing some kind of harm. It's not just someone minding their own business. It's like secondhand smoke. Their bad decision doesn't affect just them. But in theory, if you've identified a harm, the goal should be to stop that harm. And I'm pretty willing to bet you've never changed your mind about something because someone screamed at you about being an idiot who's murdering children. And beyond that, there's compelling research to suggest that, contrary to popular belief, facts are rarely why anyone changes their mind. Yes, even you, dear skeptic, even I. Humans are emotional creatures, and we tend to be more open to new facts when they're presented in particular ways, especially ways that don't come across as trying to challenge something we already believe or change our mind. You'd be shocked how easy it is to get people to agree with ideologies they disagree with by name just by framing them in the right way.
Even when facts are presented online, the neutral seeming, even tone they're presented with in of itself is, in some sense, an emotional appeal. Arguments that are factually correct but littered with grammatical errors or take a non standard dialect may be dismissed, and arguments that are incorrect but presented with a professional appearance and a more rigorous argument can get by without much scrutiny from a reader. See Ben Shapiro debating. I'm also willing to bet you've heard things that you initially virulently disagreed with because it was so distant from your present understanding that you rejected it without logical consideration. It's undoubtedly a good goal to try to reduce this sway of emotion, but it's also human, and not a grand failing on the part of people who sometimes fail to mitigate that effect. As I mentioned above, it's not completely unwarranted to be a little contemptuous at people who are probably making the population sicker. But I really don't feel like it's all moral outrage. I think that's a cover-up because we know that the real reason is a little bit less moralistic. I mean, I rarely see skeptics interacting directly with this kind of person. I mostly see them among themselves, and when they do get confrontational, it looks baity. They'll post these long diatribes on anti-vax pages that basically amount to either, "I'm pleading you, before you cause harm and suffering, please consider your actions. Please read the science." That reads with about as much sincerity as birthright ladies telling a 15-year-old girl what a great mother she'll be, or a paragraph's long dunk on everyone on the page that's clearly intended to be read and liked by fellow skeptics as opposed to convince anyone of anything.
It reminds me a lot of Peter Coffin's video about multi-level marketing companies, specifically the parts about the groups dedicated to railing against MLMs and the people who distribute for them. Not all of the points apply because there aren't literal corporations purposely trying to trick and mislead people down this anti-science path, other than, of course, the Gwyneth Paltrow industrial complex and some health food and essential oil type companies, but certainly these groups in theory have less financial sway than the medical industry. But the points on how we react to their being tricked apply pretty evenly here. Much like those of us who watch our social media friends lose money on these businesses with the kind of smug contempt for their foolishness, and a sense that we're fundamentally different, smarter, wiser than them, in reality, the main thing that separates us from them is our environment, our individual circumstances, that we saw the criticism before someone tried to rope us in. Our insistence that they've done something to deserve it mostly just assures us that we won't face any similar risk.
The other reason I'm pretty against this model of they deserve it because they're lazy or stupid or child murderers, in addition to a general preference for structural explanations for widespread issues rather than epidemic personal failure, is because it seems abundantly clear to me that we're not dealing with a suburban domestic bioterrorism problem. What I mean to say is, they are doing what they, given the best of their knowledge, life experience, and personal sense of the world, is the right, safe thing for their family. Now, I don't know if you've ever sat in on the internal conversations of the people who believe these things, but it's not really the parody of, like, vaccines are evil, doctors are evil, they want to kill my Aiden, that they're generally made out to be. There are a lot of scared moms. A lot of them are geographically or socially isolated because they're stay-at-home moms or just on maternity leave. Oftentimes their stance is less, vaccines are evil, and more, it seems like a lot of people are saying a lot of conflicting things, and I don't want to subject possibly the thing I love most on this planet to potential danger. We fail on basically every level to teach people scientific literacy in school. And when you don't understand how science is communicated, or what it means for a result to be significant, or how sample sizes work, it's all kind of difficult to navigate. And it's difficult to know who to trust. But when one group of people is telling you to just listen to a specific group of scientists, and the other says, well, the data isn't in, so you should be cautious, the latter option can sound like the safer bet.
The research looking into the demographics of anti-vaxxers broadly falls into two categories: polls of the population in general, and studies looking at data from Facebook and other social media platforms. While the research on the social media anti-vax movements largely reflects the experience and assumption I'm sure most of us have, that the movement is largely made up of women, often concentrated in areas with higher concentrations of new parents and higher incomes, The research that focuses on vaccine skepticism, not necessarily tied to the greater online movement, tells a somewhat different story. In these polls, anti vaxxers are more often non white, non college educated, and lower income. In light of this, I'll be referring to both of these profiles of anti vaxxers. A handful of themes in explanations of vaccine skepticism have been identified by researchers. These include trust, that is, they are suspicious of the scientific community and are concerned with personal liberty. Alternatives, they focus on the presence of chemicals in vaccines and look for safer, that is, homeopathic alternatives. Safety, they are concerned vaccines may be dangerous or impure. And conspiracy, they believe the government and scientists are hiding evidence of harm from the public. These themes represent a worldview that, while wrong, is nonetheless difficult to crack. The evidence you give isn't trustworthy to them. It was funded by Big Pharma. Vaccines aren't a substantial source of revenue? Well, this one's got mercury in it. That seems dangerous. There are safer alternatives anyway, and after all, it's their choice. Why should they have to put their child at risk when we clearly don't know for sure?
And it's frustrating to go through this because these aren't crazy arguments, even if that's how they make you feel. They have a logic to them. It's a logic being propelled by fear, but fear makes people find ways to logically justify all sorts of awful shit. And the problem isn't so much an issue of irrationality as it is the scale of a collective decision and proportion of reasonable fear. What I mean by that is, we're dealing with the issue of a lot of scared, misinformed individuals whose main fault is being ignorant and overly afraid. And when that happens on a large scale, the effects can be incredibly dangerous. Or, in other words,
a person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it.
We can't really expect parents to get careless about their children's well-being, so in order for this to work, parents need to have trust that the potential benefit is greater than the risk of harm. That the people on this side of the debate are the ones with their best interests at heart. And it seems like when it comes to scientists and medical professionals, especially doctors, that kind of trust has declined.
The decline of trust in scientists is not too difficult to understand, but the crisis in trust will be difficult to repair. After all, most people don't know or interact with scientists. They seem to be these people who look at a very small piece of the world in great detail and come out with advice and findings that often seem to contradict each other. Just look at pop science reporting. One of the only jokes I can make at work that works cross-demographically is about how we find out a new thing that causes or prevents cancer every day, and it's often the same thing. And then on the other hand, science is also this thing that can prove these giant, sweeping statements about the world, like the Earth is round and the force of gravity equals mass times acceleration. But if put on the spot, could you successfully explain why we know these things? We're usually just given this information, and unless you're fortunate enough to get to replicate experiments that show how we know light is both a wave and a particle at the same time, you don't really realize how banal it looks. Scientific progress is so slow, and biology and medicine are not the slowest, but they're not far off. People don't read these headlines on a daily basis with the understanding in their head that this one study being looked at was an outlier that only got published because all of the other papers saying the opposite were deemed too uninteresting for publication. Most are on some level aware that science can be flawed and imperfect and outright wrong, but they're not really as equipped with how this happens. Not to mention, we're in the middle of a replicability crisis. This is all to say, yeah, I get why people can be suspicious of scientists, but I think better science education is the answer. Also, removing the profit motive from research and publishing so we can get the boring common data into the meta-analysis and have research that feels more comprehensive and less sensationalistic. The issue of doctor distrust is less simple and more directly harmful. The researchers in one study on public trust of physicians believe that the commodification of healthcare, the financial interests of the providers, or having unmet health needs, like those without insurance, are all likely contributors. Another layer to this is that gender bias further wears away trust in the medical system. Women broadly have a perception that doctors don't trust their self-reports of their medical concerns, with invisible illnesses and especially mystery pains getting dismissed as psychosomatic, as if that could be known for sure, and as if that makes them any less painful. And before we get into an argument about this, while I personally think this perception on the part of women is justified, in terms of fixing the issue of trust, it does not matter if this perception is accurate or not. It will need to be addressed either way.
I've watched my mother go through this many times in my life, have doctors completely dismiss concerns she had about her body. She's gone through a lot of doctors this way. I think that watching her has informed how I think about this issue, and it's made me be a lot more careful about how I present myself when I raise a medical concern so that I can be taken seriously.
As I mentioned previously, there's another profile of vaccine skeptic who's less organized online, but, according to some studies, makes up a larger percentage of vaccine skeptics: lower income and non-white people, and by a slight majority men. While I can't speak to it as personally, people of color have plenty of reason to be suspicious of doctors, and not just due to the long, complicated relationship of race and medicine. A particularly harrowing example of this is that of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where black men who unknowingly had syphilis were purposefully denied treatment by researchers, who also failed to inform them of what they had, for the purpose of studying the progression of the disease. 28 men died directly from syphilis, 100 from related issues. Several went blind or insane and experienced other complications while researchers continued to provide inadequate care despite the availability of an existing treatment. Since they were not treated or informed, subjects also passed the disease to 40 spouses and 19 children at birth. Check the description for some additional links on this subject. It's also worth noting that often lower income and non-white people who don't vaccinate are not doing so by choice, as poverty and a more general lack of access makes getting such care costly and difficult. Strangely, this explanation for lower vaccine rates is not as popular to examine as those intentionally not vaccinating, despite it being easier to address.
My first instinct tells me that the solution to this is for doctors to have more empathy for their patients, and I genuinely think that this would make a big difference. But there are many structural and cultural barriers making this easier said than done. The current structure of the medical system incentivizes doctors to remember to keep costs in the back of their mind even as much as they do sincerely care about their patients. And one of the patient's main interactions with doctors is the financial transaction, making a relationship that should be about mutually working to improve the patient's health more in line with the type of adversarial relationships found in other marketized systems. Single-payer healthcare would be a good way to address some of these issues. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would certainly be a start. We need to do our best to approach people who feel like the scientific establishment and the medical system have failed them, or don't care about them, or are trying to take advantage of them, to approach them with as much empathy as we can muster. Not only because we have a better chance of getting through to them this way, and not only because it's not clear how much more than a change of circumstances we are away from believing exactly as they do, but also because we get to a point where blaming and punishing individuals who've just made a choice is just pointlessly punitive. If we want things to change, we can't just keep yelling at people and asking why they haven't changed yet. We need to change the circumstances. In particular, we need a scientific and medical community that is structured to serve people, not profits. An education system that values and has the resources and training to engender an understanding of the scientific method and scientific consensus on common issues while not quashing skepticism, and instead seeking to explain, as well as making research more accessible rather than hidden behind paywalls. And most importantly, a healthcare system where people's needs are met on the basis of being human and deserving to live healthily into their full potential, not on the basis of financial access. So, maybe the next time you're feeling like yelling at some anti-vaxxer or just feeling a little bit smug, maybe don't. Or, if you're feeling particularly feisty, try and genuinely engage with their experiences with the medical system. I'm sure each of them would have been in favor of at least one, maybe more of these ideas. Maybe we can actually advance a movement to change things in a way that will actually solve the problem.
The publication Science for the People was originally founded and has since been reestablished partially to accomplish some of these exact goals. It's a fantastic resource which provides a reasoned and very pro-science critique of some aspects of the scientific apparatus, as well as a strong commitment to making science more understandable and accessible to all people. I highly recommend checking them out and supporting them if you're able. They were a huge inspiration for me in writing this. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I got to film this in my bedroom at my parents' house, where I spent a good chunk of quarantine, hence the scenery change. That said, I did move out of the apartment all my other videos were filmed in like a year ago. Yeah, I'm not doing myself any favors with the all-powerful algorithm with this uploading schedule, but unfortunately it's very difficult to overcome how I am as a person. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hopefully my next video will be up in under a year this time.